This study might be the coolest study of 2022 in endurance sport nutrition science, maybe the coolest study of this first half of the decade. Dr. Tim Podlogar just published a study asking the question, is there a difference in the way your body uses carbohydrates and how much does it use when you consume 120 grams per hour during exercise versus 90 grams per hour during exercise? This is like one of my favorite topics. It's probably the #1 topic in endurance sport nutrition. The study is groundbreaking because that's an important question, and the fact that they asked it sets a precedent that we're not done yet. 90 grams of carbs per hour isn't the maximum, and we should continue studying to find out what is the maximum. Should it be 90, 100, 130, 135? These kinds of questions have been rarely asked since the year 2000, or maybe like 2014, because there were a few studies by a few prominent researchers that came out, and their sort of like public messaging was 90 is good enough, there's enough GI distress above that, and not enough performance benefit above that we don't really need to look anymore. I think it shut down a lot of folks from looking into this. So it's really cool that you have people re-asking the question now in 2022, and I would say it's about time. Dr. Podlogar just got his PhD under Dr. Wallis, who's the 4th author on the paper, at the University of Birmingham, and they recruited 2 of Dr. Podlogar's colleagues from Slovenia to collect all the data for this study. So Dr. Podlogar reports one conflict of interest, that he's a consultant for a nutrition company called Endogenous, and he also, not reported here, but he also has his own consulting company where he coaches athletes, and he's also held roles with pro cycling teams in the past as sort of like nutrition consultant and just handing out bottles at races. So this guy is like both in the research lab and in the trenches actually working with pro athletes. To say that these guys might be incentivized to sell more product, sell more sugar, I don't think that would be a stretch. They may have incentives in their lives that would encourage them to sell more sugar and encourage higher carbohydrate recommendations during exercise for endurance athletes, and they may profit from that. Here is the final line of the study, and I think you'll see why I think that they did a very good job of swallowing any bias, if they have any at all. From a whole body metabolism point of view, this study's data demonstrate that ingesting carbohydrate at a higher rate than currently recommended 90 grams of carbs per hour does not provide any benefits. So whatever incentives they're bringing to the table, I think they're doing a masterful job eliminating bias in their research. And the reason I think that is because I think I could make the case that 120 grams of carbs per hour is beneficial based on the results and discussion that I see here. So in a literal sense, they're correct. This study does not actually demonstrate that 120 grams of carbs per hour is better than 90 grams of carbs per hour. But if you really get into the data and look at the trends, and I'll show you the graphs, you're going to find out that with exercise durations longer than 3 hours, you're going to see some really interesting things. Let's actually look at the study. So throughout the introduction, they're sort of setting the stage that the case is not closed. If you've read anything about carbohydrate consumption and like cycling, triathlon, the case that you've probably heard, it's open shut, 90 grams of carbs per hour is the upper limit, and then maybe now you're hearing like 100 grams of carbs per hour, or if you watch our YouTube channel, you're hearing much higher. But he lays out in the introduction beautifully that the case is not shut, it's not closed, and that it merits further research. He says, in line with this, evidence demonstrates oxidation rates of ingested glucose-based carbohydrate peak at the rate of 1 to 1.1 grams per minute. That's 60 to 66 grams of carbs per hour for glucose, but peak around 1.5 grams per minute, that's 90 grams of carbs per hour, when fructose is added. Different fructose to glucose ratios have been compared, and it was found that at a fructose to glucose ratio closer to unity, i.e. 0.8 to 1, as compared to the established 1 to 2, offers benefits from efficiency of utilization, gastrointestinal comfort, and performance standpoints, which is most likely due to more efficient intestinal absorption of both monosaccharides. So he's saying, heads up guys, the research that was done in 2004 on 90 grams of carbs per hour was done using a carbohydrate ratio of 2 to 1 glucose to fructose. There's a better way. It's probably closer to 1 to 1, and he cites 1 to 0.8 glucose to fructose. And if we use that ratio, we might get higher ability to absorb carbohydrates without GI distress. He goes on, we hypothesized that ingesting carbohydrate at the rate of 120 grams per hour as compared to 90 grams per hour would result in higher exogenous and lower endogenous carbohydrate utilization rates while not negatively affecting gut comfort. So what he's saying there, we think that you'll burn more carbs from the outside that you consume, and you will burn less carbs from your muscle stores and liver stores during exercise if you consume 120 grams of carbs per hour compared to if you consume 90 grams of carbs per hour, and you'll do it with the same gut comfort between the conditions. Let's find out if that happens. So Dr. Podlogar goes and has his colleagues in Slovenia recruit 11 cyclists from Slovenia who have an average VO2 max of 62, which is good. These guys are competitive, at least enthusiast cyclists. They have an average ventilatory threshold 1 of 270, that's 270 watts, and they have an average ventilatory threshold 2 of 338 watts, roughly, I think. And what that means is these guys are probably like Cat 2 cyclists, if I had to guess, if they were in the United States, maybe Cat 3, depending on their tactical skills, if they're not very tactically savvy. So that's like regionally competitive, bordering on nationally competitive. Average body weight of the subjects was 80 kilos, which I would say is actually rather large for highly competitive cyclists. These guys are actually pretty representative of normal, like you and me, everyday cyclists. They recruited heavier guys to get higher absolute fitness levels so that they could have higher carbohydrate burn rates. The good news is a lot of like enthusiast and recreational, like if you're watching this study, you're probably an enthusiast. We tend to be larger than the average pro cyclist, and we tend to actually have less difference between our power outputs and pro athletes, and a bigger difference between our watt per kilo because they're doing the same watts as us, but they weigh 20 kilos less. That doesn't mean go lose weight, just remarking. Dr. Podlogar is setting up this study really well to test, is there a case where 120 grams of carbs per hour is more beneficial or can create exogenous carbohydrate burn higher than 90 grams of carbs per hour? He's picking the right subjects with the right fitness level. So these guys fast overnight, as in they just don't eat during the night, and then they come into the lab and they ride for 3 hours, no breakfast. I hate it, but I love it because he's setting up a good situation for when higher carbohydrate fueling might be useful and might show the biggest differences between lower carbohydrate fueling. It's hard to find subjects for this. Statistical power is always limited. And what that means is it's very hard for it to be allowed for a researcher to say, we found that X was better than Y, because unless you find that p-value of 0.05 or less, and what that means is it's statistically significant, you cannot say we found a finding. If it's 0.06, which means to any lay person looking at the data, they'd be like, well, it's freaking different. It worked. The people got better. They were better in this certain condition. You still have to say the conditions were equal. It drives me crazy, but it's what keeps research rigorous. But that doesn't mean we can't use our brains and put our thinking caps on and actually look at the nuanced differences in the data and sort of intuit where the data is going. Now, that's a dangerous game if that's all you're doing, but if you have a good bird's eye view of the overall lay of the land of all of the literature and you understand the physiological mechanisms, you can sort of be a futurist looking ahead, visualize where the research is probably going to go, and visualize like, what does this mean for me? So how does Dr. Podlogar figure out how much of the carbohydrate that a person is burning is coming from outside versus inside? The answer is carbon-13. So they use carbohydrate supplements that are high in carbon-13, and then they track how much of that carbon-13 is being exhaled. And from that, they can calculate how much of what was ingested is actually being burned and how much of it is just sitting in your gut still. So they bring each subject in and have them cycle on a cycle ergometer for 3 hours. They measure blood glucose, blood lactate, rating of perceived exertion, and a measure of stomach comfort. So before we get into the differences they found between groups, and there were some really interesting differences, let's look at what the cyclists actually consumed and how they consumed it over the course of the 3 hours so that we can better understand the results when we get there. Participants ingested a total of 2.3 liters of a test beverage in each trial containing either 270 grams of fructose and maltodextrin or 360 grams of fructose and maltodextrin to deliver carbohydrate at an average rate of either 1.5 grams per minute or 2 grams per minute. That's 90 grams of carbs per hour or 120 grams of carbs per hour. A 500 milliliter bolus was provided at exercise onset. Of that 2.3 liters, 500 mils are consumed right when they get on the bike. That leaves 1.8 liters left. Every 15 minutes after that until the end of exercise, they're consuming 150 milliliters. That's like a little less than a cup. It's like 6 ounces. So my first questions when I read those fluid amounts was, man, that seems low. These guys are in a lab. Usually cyclists sweat a lot in a lab. Usually there's not like really good AC and ventilation. Maybe where they conducted it in Slovenia, that's nice and cool, or maybe they have really good air conditioning. But in my experience in an exercise physiology lab, I'm dumping sweat at a rate of way greater than 1 liter per hour. These guys are big guys. Like, they're going to sweat a lot, and 600 mils of water per hour, not going to fully replace all that they're losing during a 3-hour lab test at a pretty high aerobic intensity. And the problem with that is if you get dehydrated, your gut comfort and your gut ability to absorb goes out the window. It surprised me that there wasn't a higher fluid intake rate. Further, I see no mention of sodium in the paper, and I think it's pretty well evidenced that both water and carbohydrates are absorbed better when sodium is included in the beverage, and sodium helps maintain hydration status. So I have some concerns with regard to sodium and fluid intake used in this study. Promising news for future research is that if they did find 120 grams of carbs per hour was tolerated as well as 90 grams of carbs per hour, that we could find it even more tolerable in the future with better hydration. In sports science, 1% changes changes matter, 5% changes matter, and they're often considered insignificant statistically, but they're very meaningful. The reason that they have to say fat oxidation rates didn't differ between conditions is because they didn't have enough subjects to meet statistical power needs to be able to say, based on the variability of the subjects that they had, we can say with a certain degree of certainty that fat oxidation was different between conditions. But if you look at the graph, there's daylight between fat oxidation between the conditions, but statistically they have to say no different. Exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates increased over time and were significantly higher in the 120 gram condition as compared to 90 grams. P equals 0.026. What that P value means is just barely less than 0.05. They skated into statistical significance, but when you look at the graph, there is daylight between the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rate found in 120 grams per hour compared to 90 grams per hour. And it's like an enormously meaningful amount in sports science. If you're riding a bike, you're going to feel that difference. It's not something that you could miss. Their first graph, they have total carbohydrate oxidation rate. When I look at it, I see daylight between 120 grams of carbs per hour and 90 grams of carbs per hour. Every single data point, 120 grams of carbs per hour, has a higher total carbohydrate oxidation rate. The variability shows that there is a lot of overlap between groups, and because they only have 11 subjects, they can't confidently say that that's different. But again, this is a case of where any sane person is going to look at that graph and be like, 120 grams of carbs per hour burned more carbohydrate than the other group. Graph B, fat oxidation rate. Again, same story, really wide variability in the fat oxidation rate. And so even though there's even more daylight between that top row of dots and the bottom row of dots, top row being 90 grams of carbs per hour, bottom row being 120 grams of carbs per hour, they still can't claim that those lines are different, even though, again, any sane person is going to look at those lines and be like, yep, different. Okay, moving on to the graph that is going to gain Dr. Podlogar some fame and what I think makes this study really, really cool. So this exogenous carbohydrate rate, it's very clear that the 120 grams per hour group burned more carbs from exogenous sources. That is, the stuff that they're drinking is getting burned in their muscles at a higher rate than the 90 grams of carbs per hour. And interestingly, it's up near 1.5 grams per minute of exogenous carbohydrate burn. And what that means is they're burning 90 grams of carbs per hour from outside their body. And the reason that's cool, you can see that there's actually quite a variability in how much carbohydrate each person is burning from the outside source. So in the fourth graph of carbohydrate burn rates, they look at endogenous carbohydrate oxidation. And they find that, yeah, truly, there really isn't a difference between how much carbohydrate you're burning from endogenous stores. What that means is, even though you're consuming more carbohydrate, you are not sparing your muscle glycogen. Unfortunately, statistically, they have to say, we don't know why you're not sparing your muscle glycogen. Turns out it's because you're actually burning less fat, at least according to this very obvious difference in the lines on the graph. The first third, sort of, the 90 and 120 groups had complete overlap in how full they reported, and there was a slight uptrend in how full they reported being. In the second third, there was a divergence. The 90 group started to trend down, and the 120 group continued to trend up a little. I think the most interesting thing about this stomach fullness chart is that both groups leveled off after that, and there was no further increase in the 120 group's stomach fullness ratings. The reason I think there was that divergence in the second third there is because 120 grams of carbs per hour in 600 mils of water per hour is pretty high concentration, and it's going to slow absorption time in your gut. How much abdominal cramping? Virtually zero. Nausea. You'll notice that there was just a slight uptick into like the 1.5 range, 1 being the absolute lowest, so it's 1 to 10, not 0 to 10. The 120 group had a very, very non-significant trend towards increased nausea about midway through the study, and it leveled off. Probably like one guy reported a tiny bit of nausea. So overall, in terms of gut comfort, there is a slight difference in gut comfort between 90 and 120. I would argue that that difference in gut comfort could have been attenuated if they consumed a little bit more water and more sodium, but I'm unsure if they even consumed sodium at all. It wasn't even discomfort. It was like a super mild stomach fullness reported by the 120 gram per hour group. And it wasn't trending up. That's the most important thing, is at 3 hours, it wasn't trending up. We don't have a 7-hour study for gut comfort for like Ironman athletes. We don't have a 9-hour, a 10-hour, 15-hour study on carbohydrate oxidation rates. So we sort of have to like imagine where those lines would go. And so far, at 3 hours, we got no uptrend whatsoever in gut comfort for either group. That's awesome. They're essentially equivalent. Now, the one graph that I wish they had was the blood glucose graph. I so wish that Dr. Podlogar had been allowed to, or had chosen to, put a chart of the blood glucose values for the two groups against each other in this study. And actually, I think I'm going to make a graph. I just noticed on the front page. Tim Podlogar and Spela Bokal contributed equally to this work. Meanwhile, I've been thanking Tim profusely for all of his amazing work and asking him all the questions. Spela, I don't know if you're Dr. Spela or Dr. Bokal, Dr. Spela Bokal. Thank you. Super solid work. I will look out for your name in the future. I made a graph, and I figured out why Dr. Podlogar didn't probably include this graph in his manuscript. And the reason is he probably realized it was not a very valuable graph. He had to squish down the axis a bunch. That made the lines basically be right on top of each other and be visually indistinguishable. And you're not allowed to use trend lines in this scenario because it's not statistically appropriate, but we're not in research, so we can do whatever we like. So the first thing I did, I removed the lines between the dots. Then I plotted trend lines, which is a big bad no-no in research, but who cares? And then I removed the error bars, which is like inexcusable. And then I zoomed in to a better axis so that we could actually see the difference between the trend lines and do it in a meaningful way. If you look at the trend overall for the groups, there was a pretty big difference. The 120 grams per hour folks had a blood glucose rate of decrease over the 3-hour ride of 1.5 milligrams per deciliter. The 90 gram per hour group had a rate of decrease of 5 milligrams per deciliter. Why does that matter? Well, that's triple the rate of blood glucose decrease in the 90 grams per hour group. So if 3 hours were to pass, you'd have a reduction of 15 milligrams per deciliter blood glucose in a 90 gram per hour scenario for this group of subjects, and you'd have only 4.5 milligrams per deciliter lower blood glucose for the 120 gram per hour group. Why does that matter? Well, one of the primary reasons to do high carb fueling is to elevate your blood sugar into a range that promotes cognitive drive and provides fuel to the working muscle. Preventing blood sugar decreases is like goal number one. So then, since I'm already breaking all research rules and we're on YouTube, I figured I would just ask, like, what does this look like compared to like what I think an ideal blood glucose level would look like for a 3-hour ride? Ideally, it's not trending down over the course of your activity if you're fueling appropriately and you're meeting the needs of your body. There on graph number 9 is what I think would be just a reasonable optimal blood glucose level for this type of exercise. You can see that both of the groups are actually falling away from what I think is optimal. I think that these athletes probably are capable of consuming more than 120 grams of carbs per hour, especially if they get a little bit more fluid and sodium in a fasted state. So they started with pretty low blood glucose levels. It's really common in this research field to do research on 3 hours long bike rides. And it's usually during those 4th, 5th, 6th, 10th hours of exercise that exogenous carbohydrate intake really starts to matter. And I think if we extrapolate the data out, which is like cardinal sin number 1000, you will see why carbohydrate fueling starts to really matter after 3 hours, even in these very well-trained cyclists who are intaking a lot of carbs. I think if Tim had the opportunity to research this same group of cyclists over 5 hours duration or 6 hours duration, he would see the trends in his blood glucose continue, and they would continue to separate. So I plotted that, and let's check it out. The orange and blue dots are actual data from Dr. Podlogar's study. Everything that's going to show up to the right of that 3-hour line, that vertical line down the middle of the graph, is fake data, totally fabricated, should be illegal, but I'm just trying to show you what might happen, and you can decide for yourselves if you think that's what would happen if the study were to be carried out for 4, 5, 6 hours. I threw in extrapolated out trend lines for 3 more hours, and then I threw in some data. That's what it looks like, and you can see there's a pretty big separation, and you can see that the 90 grams of carb per hour group is dipping into pretty suboptimal blood glucose levels for exercise. Like, nobody in their right mind wants to exercise when their blood glucose level is like 75 milligrams per deciliter. That's like what you should have your blood glucose level at when you wake up from an overnight sleep. The reason it's not allowed in research to do what I'm doing is because we have no idea what's going to happen after that 3-hour mark. Everybody's blood glucose levels could skyrocket. I don't think that would happen. Everybody's blood glucose levels could totally flatten out. I don't think that would happen either. I think there's good theoretical underpinnings to believe that that blood glucose rate of decrease would actually slow, and it would flatten out to a certain extent, which I showed here in this last graph. But the take-home message is there's probably going to be a greater separation as duration of exercise exceeds 3 hours. I think it's safe to say that there's value in researching 120, 130 grams of carbs per hour. Anyway, enough data manipulation. I've broken all of the rules, and I would be like laughed out of any scientific conference for doing what I just did, just trying to make a point there. The results presented in the current study support the notion of diminished return with higher carbohydrate intake rates, as oxidation efficiency was higher in the 90 gram condition compared to the 120 gram condition. This could most most likely be attributed to a difference in fructose oxidation, as the difference in ingestion of glucose-based carbohydrate was only 6 grams. He's using a term oxidation efficiency, and what he means is what percentage of the carbs that you consumed were actually metabolized during the time they measured it. And he's saying that oxidation efficiency is known to be lower for fructose ingestion because it goes through the liver and has to be converted to lactate or glucose in the liver. He thinks that they got some of the highest ever reported exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates. He had 2 out of 11, that's almost 20% of his subjects, achieve 120 grams per hour of exogenous carbohydrate oxidation. That means they're burning 120 grams per hour, almost 500 calories per hour in the form of carbohydrate, being burned and metabolized from outside sources during exercise. That's starting at 2 hours into a 3-hour ride at like high aerobic. Can you imagine what would happen if those same participants had continued for another hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? He basically goes on to say the way that they measured it, the way that they interpreted the data probably inflated the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates that they found. And so he's basically saying those 1.6 and 1.7 grams per hour probably inflated, and we haven't found much over 1.5, 1.55, so that's like 90 to 95 grams of carbs per hour. Point here is we're looking at the group average. On average, these are not nutritionally trained subjects. On average, the highest we've found in a well-designed study for a group is 1.55 grams per minute, 90 plus grams per hour of exogenous carbohydrates being oxidized during exercise. And it's been widely known forever that there's some oxidation inefficiency. You have to intake more than what you can metabolize during exercise to actually hit those peak rates. So you have to consume 120 grams per hour to hit actually 95 grams being oxidized from exogenous sources. So you can see why I like to beat this dead horse that 90 grams of carbs per hour consumption is falling short for a lot of people, because these studies in the past didn't use super high power outputs. And I would bet that in the coming decade, we're going to see pro athletes attempting carbohydrate intake rates of 140 to 160 grams per hour. I hope that our app solves all the math for people so people don't have to consider all the nuance themselves. The app can just learn about you and do that for you. But let's get into some final nuggets in his discussion section and conclusion section before we get to that third reason this study is so cool. I promise it'll be worth it. There appears to be a curvilinear dose-response relationship between ingestion of multiple transportable carbohydrates and exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates, with exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates peaking just above 1.5 grams per minute or 90 grams per hour, even when carbohydrate intake is higher. Basically, what he's saying is if you consume more, you're not going to burn much more than 90 grams of carbs per hour internally during exercise. But that's using 3-hour-long studies. Typical max oxidation rate findings are not in super long events where glycogen has been completely depleted. There's an increased reliance, as he mentions, on exogenous carbohydrate availability and oxidation once glycogen starts to get depleted and blood glucose accordingly starts to drop. And it's in those times where highest carbohydrate intake rates are going to be the most beneficial. A reduction in efficiency of oxidation of ingested carbohydrate with high doses has usually been attributed to metabolic properties of fructose, as peak exogenous glucose oxidation rates are known to be 1 to 1.1 grams per minute, even in the presence of higher glucose intake, and are likely limited by intestinal transport. According to the literature as it stands now, yes, glucose is somewhat limited to like just above 60 grams per hour, and then intestinal absorption becomes a blockade. And so that forces you to use more fructose as you exceed 60 grams of carbs per hour. The result of increasing fructose intake, though, is you reduce your oxidation efficiency. And what that means is, of the carbohydrates you consume, you burn some percentage of it. That percentage is your efficiency, and that percentage goes down with consumption of fructose. There's a transit time, there's a processing time, a digestion time for fructose. The result of that is there's just a delay in when you burn the fructose that you consume. So if you consume fructose with 30 minutes left on the clock in your 3-hour bike ride, they may not measure that you ever burned that fructose during that exercise. I would posit that oxidation efficiency probably increases slightly as duration gets longer for a couple of reasons. One, there's less fructose drop-off that doesn't get metabolized and gets metabolized sort of at the after you end exercise. And then two, you become more reliant on exogenous carbohydrate intake when your blood glucose is falling because your muscle glycogen has dropped off. And if there was any gut discomfort, sometimes that's being caused by low transit time, slow transit of contents through the gut. That can sometimes be caused by insufficient water, high concentrations, and dehydration, which pretty much wrecks your gut. And I think probably in the most disappointing sentence of the article coming up, and the most striking display of being able to be unbiased. Despite higher exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates, there was no sparing of endogenous carbohydrate stores with an ingestion rate of 120 grams per hour as compared with 90 grams per hour. While perhaps counterintuitive, increasing exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates by hyperglycemia did not further reduce endogenous carbohydrate use. Absence of differences in endogenous carbohydrate utilization rates at an average exercise intensity that is comparable to those observed in professional cycling casts a doubt whether there are any functional benefits of ingesting carbohydrate at rates higher than 90 grams per hour. I bet that felt like swallowing a rock. Dr. Tim and Dr. Wallis have been opponents of high carb, researching high carb fueling strategies. From talking with Dr. Tim, I'm pretty sure he believes that there is value in much higher carb fueling than 90 grams per hour, and I think he's probably prescribing that to all of his pro cycling clients. So I'm betting there was just a smidgen of pain as he wrote that sentence, that there is probably no functional benefit to consuming more than 90 grams of carbs per hour. He had to do it because that's the rigor of research. You have to stick to what's statistically significant, and unless you measure performance, you can't say it was beneficial, and even if blood glucose was falling faster in the lower carb group, still can't say it. And another double kudos to Tim and team. They call out two things. One, that this needs to be researched in women, and two, that this needs to be researched in longer duration of exercise. Had they gone beyond the 3-hour mark out to 4, 5, 6 hours, I think that's what the blood sugar measurements of this study were showing and what the RPE measurements were starting to show. I think had it continued out to 6 hours, the 120 group would have shown the value of fueling at a higher rate. One final thing that this group of researchers did really well in the discussion section, they call out the inter-individual variability. That is, how much do people vary between each other for how much carbohydrate they can intake. It's really important that Tim called out that there's a wide variability between people, because we don't want to cut the population in half and short half the people just because we don't acknowledge that there's variation. If we say everybody has a cap of this, then we cut 50% of the population out from peak performance. That sucks. In addition to this, a relatively large inter-individual variability in maximal exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates observed in the present and in previous studies calls for further work on what determines maximal exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates and whether there is a potential to optimize carbohydrate availability by individually prescribing carbohydrate intakes during exercise. I would agree, Tim, and that's why we are writing our app. I want to take it out of everybody's hands. There's a lot to consider. I don't like math, and honestly, having it automated for me is valuable, so we're writing an app and we're going to make it available to the public soon, but it already optimizes based on a whole host of user inputs, activity data, sweat rates, that sort of thing. Yeah, be on the lookout for that. Also, it remains to be explored if the data from the present study can be extrapolated to both sexes. Tim, if you are going to do a study on women on the same topic, max carbohydrate intake rates and exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, Alacrity will throw money at you. We will pay for interns. We will pay for maybe travel for women subjects, whatever makes it easier for you guys. You're doing amazing, amazing work. And that brings me to the third point about this article that makes it so special and so groundbreaking. This is the first article I've seen in a while that isn't funded directly by some nutrition company. I shouldn't have been surprised when I saw it, but I was totally blown away. Tim was publicly on their podcast. You may know them. They are Trainer Road, and they have cycling stuff online. I don't use their stuff. I do love their forum. I live in an RV, so I don't need indoor training. I just drive my RV to where the sun is and I go ride. But the fact that Trainer Road is funding research that I don't see a way for it to profit them because they don't sell carbohydrate products, I think that's fantastic. And I think it's really cool that they partnered with somebody that came on their podcast. I think that sets a precedent for future research to be funded by just interested companies that are in the industry that just want to be philanthropic. Fantastic. If you hear somebody say 90 grams is the max, send them to Dr. Tim's website. I'll put it in the description. Send them to this video. Send them to the Carbs video. You can find a button there. Send them somewhere where there's reasonable people talking about the nuances. And it's honestly not even that nuanced. It's very obvious. There's a range, and 90 is not the upper limit. Hey, one final thanks to Dr. Podlogar, and honestly, thank you for you guys, you folks being here. I appreciate it. I wouldn't have found this article if it weren't for one of you, so I really appreciate it. If you guys have more articles that you want us to review, you want me to review or Michelle to review, put them in the comments. I have 3 more that are coming up. Really, it's been a really good year in 2022 for new research. I haven't been this excited about research in like 3 or 4 years. If you liked this video, you thought any part of it was helpful, useful, informational, interesting, maybe give us a like. No, I shouldn't be wasting your time. Thank you for being here. I will let you go. Until next time.